Good day, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Community Central episodes, which feature different aspects of open source community building and open source projects with which Red Hat works. Before I introduce today's speaker, definitely get your questions in to the Q&A function in the Google live stream that you're watching now. And we will ask those questions to our presenter at the end of the session. And so without any further ado, I'm pleased to introduce and welcome one of my colleagues here in the Open Source Program Office, Lisa Caywood, Senior Principal Community Architect, rather. And she's going to be talking about all things Foundation. Lisa, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. And thanks to the Community Central group. We have put together a series for this season, kind of all about not just open source projects, but kind of the whole upstream ecosystem and how it all goes together. What you need to understand about all of the different variables within that ecosystem in terms of governance, in terms of how to manage the different groups and how to navigate the different groups and how to use one group to navigate another group. So we'll be talking about all of those things over the next several weeks. But just for today, we're just going to spend some time just explaining and defining some terms. Because we tend to just sort of say open source is kind of a general offhand way of talking about everything we do outside of Red Hat, but there's actually quite a lot of variation in the different types of communities that we engage with, and it's important to understand those nuances. All right, so we'll talk a bit about terminology. We'll talk about how we kind of put those things together and how you can use in order to drive change across the entire ecosystem. All right, so in the beginning, long before anything known as open source came about, there were standards bodies. Standards bodies are groups that form around a particular industry, typically. One of the very first ones was the International Telegraph Union. ITU is now known as the International Telecommunications Union. These people came together because there were all these different standards or different ways of transmitting telegraphs messages, and every country had its own way of doing things because they had their own languages, and the languages had to be encoded in different ways. They didn't have any means of encoding telegraphs in countries not using the Latin alphabet, so forth and so on. So it was all very complicated. And so there was a need for this international group to come together to formulate a set of standards around how to do that. That can be anything from the codes for the telegraph itself to the means of transmission, the type of technology that might be used for transmission, so forth and so on. Standards bodies can have a range of different scopes. They can have different geographic scopes. They can be regional. They can be national. They can be international. Most of the time, the standards are effectively gentlemen's agreements. They don't necessarily have any legal bearing, except when governments decide to encode the standards into laws. And they say, we like this standard, and we hereby declare that, for example, all telecommunications in our country must follow IETF standard law, or what have you. They are typically conceptual descriptions of how something should work. The specifics of implementation are left to the individuals or groups, companies, whomever, who were actually executing it. But they describe in principle, at a high level, how things should work. It could also be things like, a widget should be of this size and this shape and have these two prongs that are parallel to each other and are a certain width or certain circumference. These are all different types of things that could be found being put out by a standards body. So consortia are another type of industry group, typically informal, or at least they start out informal. If you're an American and grew up in the 1980s, you probably remember Where's the Beef? Beef, it's what's for dinner. That was this kind of a national ad campaign that was put out by the National Cattlemen's Association. All of the creative was then made available to various state beef boards. And it was sort of trickled down and, sort of run through a variety of different organizations who were loosely affiliated with the Cattlemen's Association. So a consortium is purely commercial. It may be for profit, it may not be. So the Cattlemen's Association itself is a nonprofit, but it is supporting commercial interests. In other cases, you might have, for example, Airbus was originally a consortium of 4 different companies from the airline industry who came together to provide different pieces of what needed to go into creating an airline or an airplane. And they ultimately wound up consolidating into the company Airbus, but originally it started out as a consortium of 4 different companies who came together for the purposes of shared R&D and development. So that's one type of consortium. Sometimes it's a joint go-to-market, as was the case in the beef industry association. Sometimes it's for the purpose of shaping public opinion. So, for example, there might be a current national panic about AI, for example, and AI is going to take over the world, and we have to bow down to our robot overlords. And an AI industry association, or that is to say, a consortium, might choose to put together a public interest campaign to help reframe public opinion, so that people are no longer fear their robot overlords. That also may extend to lobbying public officials. So it can be for a range of different purposes, activities, but ultimately in support of commercial purposes. Typically, unlike open source organizations, membership is closed by default. So you have to be a member of one of the companies supporting the consortium. So it's very much a pay-for-play kind of thing. In tech, many of these consortiums serve as sort of quasi-standards bodies, but they do operate a bit differently than sort of traditional pure standards bodies. So they may not develop the standards themselves, but they bring together standards from a number of different groups in ways that architect a sort of an end-to-end architecture that can make sense of all of the different standards that are proliferating in the wild. All right, so finally we come to our favorite topic, open source projects. There is often confusion because somebody will slap an open source license on their code and stick it on GitHub and declare that they have an open source project. They have a project that has an open source license, but that is not quite the same thing as an open source project. The project itself should also have practices that are open. So the processes, for example, for how you engage with the project, how you contribute bug fixes or code, how you get involved with committees, all of those things should be well documented. There should be a governance structure that is documented and in place, preferably with elected officials, although this is not always the case. Sometimes there is a BDFL, also known as a benevolent dictator for life. The Linux community obviously is the prime example of this. It works Mostly up to a point. There are a few BDFLs like Linus who can scale to very large and loose organizations, just as there are some startup founders who have the personal flexibility to be able to scale with the growth of their company. But by and large, founders tend to be people who really like starting things and not necessarily scaling things. And so the elective model is kind of the best case scenario for most scenarios, in the sense that it allows for leaders of different types to come in at different stages of an organization's evolution and provide new insights, different types of skills that might be needed at different stages in the project's development. It makes for a greater degree of resilience for the community. You don't have to worry about your BDFL being run over by a bus, and provides more diversity of thought, of perspectives, of different approaches and different skills. The other really important thing is public communications. They need to be accessible to everyone. So private mailing lists, private texts, text chats, even things like Slack, which you kind of need, first of all, you need an invitation to opt into it, but also Slack and Google Drive are two tools that cannot be used legally in China. And so you basically if you use those tools, you're basically declaring that you do not want any Chinese contributors in your project. And maybe that's the case, but I will also say that there was a project that I was working with at one point who spent tens of thousands of dollars to go have a booth at KubeCon in Shanghai. And they were all excited because they talked to lots of people, and lots of people seemed very excited, and they didn't understand why none of them joined afterwards when they had all of their stuff in Google Drive and Slack. And I told them why nobody from China had joined their Google Drive and Slack. It's because people in China can't do that. So it's something to be aware of. Make sure that you have a principle of public communications, but also make sure that your tools support open and public communications. Oftentimes people who are sort of vaguely interested, have maybe just heard about your project, are not necessarily currently involved with your project. The first thing that they're going to go do is they're going to go look at mailing lists and see what's going on and how people communicate with each other and what the problems are and perhaps where they might want to get engaged. And you're not going to know about those people until they have decided that they want to talk to you. And so your open public communications that are open by default at all times are one of the ways that you draw in new community members. They have to self-convert enough to be able to want to reach out to talk to you. But the only way that they can do that is if they can get, some base level of information that is, fundamentally interesting to them. So all of these things are important in building an open source project, not just simply the code license. Finally, we have open source foundations. Sometimes people will start a project and they just stick it on GitHub and that's all it's ever going to be, and that's fine. Sometimes, especially if there is an interest in making sure that we have a number of different people from different companies represented in an organization, more often than not, their company is going to want to see that the project lives in an independent entity such as an open source foundation. These logos on the left are some of the largest open source foundations. There are many more of them. And what these projects do, they serve a range of functions. First order, they're an independent place to hold funds, to hold your logo. They will sometimes take title to other IP as well. And that way, it's not being held by any one commercial entity, which can kind of scare off other commercial entities from engaging with the project. So it's independently held, the funds are independently held, It allows the project to go spend money to do things, such as market themselves or pay for uh, uh, pay for test beds and things like that. Sometimes they provide the test beds for the code. So these are the types of things that open source foundations can do. In addition, they might offer other services. Legal support is a big one. Marketing is often another one. The Linux Foundation also, they consider themselves a full service foundation. So they also offer things like events and training and research and other things like this. Others are much more bare bones, and they are really just focused very strictly on the mission of supporting the code. There's also a balance between that can vary across these organizations. Some, such as Apache, depend much more heavily on individual contributions. Others, like the Linux Foundation, are really kind of corporate first in terms of how they are funded, and therefore where they put their energy and whom and how they support contributors. The Linux Foundation in particular tends to support companies and individuals working for those companies versus kind of the bottoms up approach of some of the other organizations. The reason that all of these things are important to understand is because if you think you're going to want to take your project eventually to a foundation, you're going to want to look at kind of all of these different variables, decide what your project is going to need, and how that matches with the foundations that are out there. Some of them, such as the Software Freedom Conservancy, are very strict in terms of what they are geared up to do in terms of certain licenses that they will support, certain use cases that they will support or not support, and so on. And that's another important thing to understand. A lot of time people think that they can just pick a foundation and go take the foundation, their project to the foundation and park it there, and that's the end. In reality, it's a two-way street. The project has to meet the profile and criteria of the foundation. The foundation has to be willing to accept the project. And there are a number of different factors that go into that decision from the foundation standpoint. Does it fit with the mission of the foundation? Does it fit with the current technological focus of the foundation? Is it going to bring in enough developers to make it a viable project? Does it have enough diversity of contributors to be a long-term viable project? Is it going to be a good investment of resources on the part of the foundation, or is it just going to take away resources from other foundations or other projects within that foundation? These are all things that the foundation has to evaluate when you bring a project to them. So it's good to understand kind of the mission of each of the foundations that you might want to take your project to, and be prepared to explain all of these different things, and how your project is going to meet them when you are thinking about where you want to place your project. All right, so putting all the pieces together, we have all these different types of groups. Standards bodies tend to work very, very slowly. Consortia, depending on the goals and motivations of the key players, can either move very fast or very slowly, depending on whether the individual groups are fundamentally working at cross purposes with each other or have a burning interest in which they all have in common. Some are more kind of theoretical. Again, the standards bodies are more theoretical. Open source is purely about implementation. And so often standards bodies and open source groups will kind of work in tandem with each other. So a standards body will put out a new RFC, and one or more projects might come up with an implementation for that in code. So they often work together. And the same is true with consortia that are kind of, the Uber standards bodies that are orchestrating different standards. They will often work with open source projects who are kind of developing the code that are actually making it happen. So it's not a question of either or. They all work together. These are very complementary relationships, and it's important to understand the interrelationships between these different groups, because in some cases, if things are kind of stuck in one place, you can kind of apply pressure in a different place. It can kind of help move things along in the place where it's stuck. So if I were to give you kind of a practical example, this is from the telco world, where I spend most of my time. ETSI is kind of one of the leading standards bodies in the telco space. Another one is IETF. We have two kind of, at this point, sort of main pillars in the upstream world in terms of implementation work getting done. One is a classic open source umbrella of projects, which is LF networking. There are a number of open source projects relating to the telco industry that live under the LF networking umbrella. ORAN Alliance is a consortium, and that is to say that all of the leadership, the governance is all run by user organizations. Vendors are very actively involved in ORAN Alliance, but they are not allowed to hold leadership positions at the senior levels of leadership because it is a commercial consortium. But these two groups, LF Networking and ORAN, work very closely together. ETSI and IETF standards inform the work of both of those groups. All right, so within the LF Networking umbrella, there are a whole constellation of projects. Nefio is kind of perhaps one of the most active, along with ONEP and to a lesser extent Anuket. Nefio is a project focusing on facilitating interoperability between equipment at different levels of the stack. So Nefio works very closely with ORAN Alliance as sort of a way of making possible the architectures that ORAN is in the process of putting together for the RAN sphere. There is a group called ORAN SC. SC stands for Software Community, that lives under the Linux Foundation. ORAN SC is where any code that comes out of ORAN work gets stored. ORAN as a SC is expected to move under the LF networking umbrella this year. But so this is kind of a prime example of how consortia and open source projects or communities or foundations kind of work together in that very complementary fashion. ORAN doesn't have any way of or any real place for holding code. That's not how their governance is set up, and so that's why they partnered with the Linux Foundation in order to do that. Silva is another open source project run out of LF Europe. They are another architecture focused community. They are taking most of the work that's coming out of ORAN, adding some special sauce related that's specifically targeting EU regulations around security and privacy and sustainability. They are also pulling in the work from Nefio as they're working through this process. And they're going to take the whole thing and they're going to run it in the Anuket testbed. That is their plan. So again, you kind of see how all of these things come together. We have sort of another cluster off to the right there, Open Air Interface, OpenStack, 3GPP. Open Air Interface and OpenStack are sort of your classic open source projects. 3GPP is kind of more of a consortium, but they all work very closely together. Open Air Interface is all based on standards effectively that come out of 3GPP. NGMN is another mostly RAN focused consortium. They work closely with ORAN Alliance on certain topics, especially with regard to sustainability and AI. So they are again using a lot of the work that comes, or the thought that comes out of ORAN Alliance to develop further develop some of the topics that they're most particularly focused on. And then we have a few others sort of around the edges. LF Edge and Camera are also open source projects under the Linux Foundation. GSMA is another industry consortium that again, pulls from all of these other groups, for the particular interests of their members, the particular topics that they're working on. So hopefully that gives you kind of a big picture of how all of these things come together. It's important to understand what the map is for your particular industry, so that you can understand kind of, if things are kind of stuck, for example, in ORAN, well, if work is happening, very quickly in Nefio, they can give something to ORAN sooner rather than later that says, hey, this is how we're going to do things. And that can kind of help sometimes break the logjam in ORAN, to kind of move things along. It's like, well, here's something that's actually here and real and tangible that people will actually use. So maybe we use that and we kind of build from there. So these are kind of understanding kind of the lay of the land is really important when it comes to deciding, should I engage in this group? Should I engage in that group? The answer might be, maybe it may be a moderate use case for the group itself, but understanding how that group interfaces with the other groups in the landscape might change the value proposition one way or another for that group. And with that, I will hand it back off to Brian.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation, Lisa. We do have a number of questions in Q&A. I'm going to open those up. So actually, one was asked and answered, but James asked, do we have updated mapping of all international standards bodies like ISO, IEC, etc., as well as globally, for, consortia like OASIS and then the foundations that Red Hat is participating in. And Lisa, you may have an answer to that. I will tell you that, our colleague Jenny did reply and said, that right now we don't have an active map of who Red Hat belongs to in terms of those organizations. But since we do manage the memberships on our side and we have all this data and information, we are working on creating a database that everybody in Red Hat can see and use. And if you had something to add to that, feel free.
Sure. I would say that there's sort of that the getting the arms around what all we're members of is kind of the first step in creating those maps of the sort that I was just showing. When it comes to what does the map of a particular industry look like, that's something that on my team within OSPO, the verticals team or the industry team, we take a look at for the industries that we cover. There are a number of industries that we don't have staff within our particular team. And that's something that you might want to perhaps work with OSPO to kind of help begin to understand how all those things go together. But you're absolutely right. The first step is just getting the arms around, where all of our memberships are, because occasionally things happen, often a BU somewhere, somebody, just pays for something and we don't know about it. Not how it's supposed to work. It happens sometimes. So making sure that we are aware of everything that's out there and that we're engaged with. It is also helpful to understand there are a number of groups that are out there that we're not engaged with for one reason or another. But it's still helpful to understand kind of where they live in the overall map of an ecosystem. If only because understanding why we're not involved with them is helpful.
Okay. The next question is from Rich, who asks, how do Control IQ and RESF, which is the Rocky Linux Oriented Foundation, fit within the definitions that you've set up?
So I don't think I'm familiar with IQ. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I can address the RSEF question if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay, so for those, there are certain organizations that we will participate in, but we are not necessarily members of. So we will have contributors that are involved in projects that are, under, the Rocky Enterprise Foundation that you mentioned. And so those following lines of those are more technical contribution partnerships. It is like hypothetically possible. We don't necessarily have to be a member of the Apache Software Foundation, although we are, to have contributors, working on any of the Apache projects. And so in this case, we are not formal members of the foundations that you mentioned, but I'm aware, at least with the Rocky one, that we definitely have some people contributing. And they are contributing on our CentOS stream. So hopefully that answers that question. The next one is a follow-up from James, who asks, how would you improve within the context of SCOs, notably European harmonized standards, which implement EU legislation such as CRA, of producing standards which are implementable into open source?
How would we improve on them? I guess I'm not entirely sure what that means, but um, if the question is how we engage with them,
Mm-hmm.
So we have of course our public policy group who works with the EU and various other governmental organizations to understand kind of their goals and what they're looking for. And we in OSPO partner with that group in order to understand kind of how we're advising those governmental entities and how we might work with um, those standards bodies in order to sort of bring our position to the table.
Excellent. And Sean McCants, another colleague from OSPO, did jump in and remind me that CIQ is a private company. RESF is structured like a foundation, but it is a privately held company. So in that context, his answer is more clear. These are not actually foundation-like organizations, even though our ESF is structured that way. How do we measure the impact of a membership to a specific foundation? Is the next question from William.
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, at the end of every year, we take a look at all of our memberships, and we in OSPO will reach out to the stakeholders and say, how's it going? Are you getting value from this? It is, I would say that for the groups that are under the purview of, again, the industry team, we tend to give them a slightly closer scrutiny. Excuse me. In the sense that we are looking at this whole map and looking at, are we, is this contributing to the big picture, and if so, how? Typically, when we start a membership, one of the things that we really want to look at very concretely is, what are our goals with this? Sometimes we're just there because our customers really want us to be there, and that's fine. But so then when we're putting together the business case, we say, which customers want us to be there? What do they want us to do there? And what are the potential deals on the table if we do this? And then, at the end of the year, we'll kind of take a look back and say, did this satisfy the need? Do we need to continue? Or did we get what we and the customer needed to get out of it? And can we walk away now? So those are sort of some of the kinds of questions we engage with. In other cases, if it's a more sort of technically focused engagement, we want to steer a technology or a standard in a particular direction, or we just want to keep tabs on how things are going. It's a little bit squishier. And it then becomes a question of, does it make sense for us to continue putting a resource here, or can we just, have someone check the minutes every once in a while and not be members anymore? So it's not a hard and fast science for sure. We do look at contributions, technical contributions for organizations where we have a more technical interest, where it's not sort of sales driven. And Callie Dolphy on Brian's team is doing a lot of work to understand kind of what our contributions are to any particular organization, and getting that data, in a nice packaged fashion is a work in progress, but something that she's driving very aggressively. So.
Thank you for that mention. James has a follow-up question, but we will take that offline. And there are two basically questions about housekeeping. One is, will the deck be available? Yes, the deck and recordings of the session will be available later this week. And then Bram asks, will future sessions focus on skills needed to contribute to OS projects, such as GitLab, workflows, etc.? Yes, we can definitely add that to the schedule. The idea of Community Central is always talking about, what are best practices around all parts of open source and projects and development and community building. So yeah, with that, I think we've gone through all the questions. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. We definitely appreciate your time and effort putting this together.
All right, thanks very much.
All right. And with that, everyone, thank you very much. Thanks for coming back for this new episode of Community Central. Thanks for working with us with all the technical issues. We'll have them ironed out for our next episode in a couple of weeks. Look to your calendars for that. And until then, be safe, be well, and have a great day.